In 1968, a geologist walking across the eroding edge of a dry lake bed in southwestern New South Wales noticed something sticking out of the sand, a small, scorched fragment of bone. It looked almost nothing. It turned out to be one of the most important archaeological finds in the history of the entire continent, and it would eventually force scientists to rewrite everything they thought they knew about how long people had lived in Australia. Before this discovery, the official scientific position was that humans had only reached Australia around 20,000 years ago. That fragment of bone and the skeleton it belonged to pushed that number back by tens of thousands of years within a matter of years. And that wasn't even the strangest part. In the decades that followed, this same dry lake bed would produce a body burned and buried in a way no one on Earth had ever documented before. Footprints of people running at full sprint, frozen in hardened mud. And a Dina result so bizarre that for 15 years, some scientists thought it might unravel the entire accepted story of where modern humans came from. This is Lake Mungo, in the Willandra Lakes region of New South Wales, a place so dry today that it hasn't held a drop of water in roughly 14,000 years, and yet somehow keeps producing some of the most significant human discoveries anywhere on the planet. And even now, parts of what was found here are still being argued about, corrected, and in one case, formally apologised for. If you're new here, welcome to Hidden Origins. This channel is dedicated to unearthing Australia's unknown, the hidden caves, the sacred sites, the geological wonders, and the historical mysteries most people never hear about. We dig into the real science and the real Indigenous history behind them, without the exaggeration. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, hit subscribe, because what actually happened at this dry lake bed is stranger and far better documented than most people realise. Lake Mungo sits in the far southwest of New South Wales, roughly 750 kilometres from Sydney, in one of the driest, flattest, and most sparsely populated stretches of the state. It's one of 17 dry lake basins that make up the Willandra Lakes region, a chain of ancient lakes that once filled with water flowing down from the Great Dividing Range, hundreds of kilometres to the east. The basins themselves are far older than the lakes that once filled them. Geologists trace their origin back tens of millions of years, to a period when this part of inland Australia gradually sank as the eastern highlands were pushed upward, leaving a shallow depression that later generations of rivers and rain would fill and drain over and over as the climate cycled between wet and dry. Lake is a misleading word for what's there today, at its fullest. Sometime between roughly 45,000 and 25,000 years ago, Lake Mungo held fresh water up to 15 metres deep, spread across more than 100 square kilometres, fed by an overflow channel connected to the wider Willandra Creek system. It supported fish, freshwater mussels, water birds, and the people who lived along its shores. Then, as the climate shifted and the rivers that fed it changed course, the lake began to dry. By around 14,000 years ago, it was empty for good, and it has stayed that way ever since. What the water left behind is what makes this place extraordinary. Along the eastern edge of the old lake bed sits a 33-kilometre crescent-shaped dune of compacted clay and sand, built up over tens of thousands of years by nothing more than the region's relentless westerly wind. It's known as a lunette, and this particular one has a nickname, the Walls of China, said to have been given by Chinese labourers who built the local wulst in the 1860s and thought the dune resembled the Great Wall back home. That dune is, in effect, a natural filing cabinet. Every time the lake's water level rose or fell, it deposited a new layer of sediment, each one chemically and visually distinct from the layers above and below it. Geologists can read these bands like the rings of a tree, reconstructing tens of thousands of years of rainfall, drought, and vegetation change in a single cliff face. The lake filled and emptied more than once over its history. High water returned around 35,000 years ago after an earlier dry spell, before a final drying phase, known locally as the Zanchi period, set in around 20,000 years ago and never reversed. As the water disappeared for good, the salt left behind in the old lake floor crystallized into gypsum, and that same salt is part of what allowed the wind to lift and carry the fine clay onto the dune in the first place. Because human camps, hearths, and burials were left directly on these ancient lakeshore surfaces, every layer of climate history comes stamped with a layer of human history sitting right alongside it. Wind has been eroding this dune for millennia, which is exactly why it keeps giving things up. As each layer is slowly stripped away, whatever was buried in it is exposed at the surface, decades or centuries after it was originally laid down. Today, walking the base of the walls of China, the ground is scattered with the eroded, fluted remains of the dune itself, a landscape so stark and otherworldly that visitors have compared it to a moonscape. It's a landscape that is, quite literally, still handing over its own evidence, one windstorm at a time. The Willandra Lakes region is the traditional country of three Aboriginal peoples, the Barkinji, the Ningiyampa, and the Mutti Mutti. Today, all three groups are formally involved in managing Mungo National Park, and their permission and guidance are required for almost any research conducted on human remains found there. Since the mid-1980s, elders have maintained a standing policy that any further human remains exposed by the dune's erosion are simply covered over and stabilised where they lie, rather than removed for study, a direct response to how the earliest excavations were carried out. What makes this place different from a typical archaeological site is the scale of continuity involved. The artefacts, hearths, and stone tools scattered through the Willandra Lake sediments show people living along these shores for at least 50,000 years long before the individual burials that made the site famous were ever laid down. That figure isn't a rounded up estimate for a TV title. It comes from dating the sediment layers the artefacts were found in, cross-checked against multiple independent methods. It places Aboriginal occupation of this specific stretch of land among the longest continuously documented human presences anywhere on the planet, and it's part of the evidence supporting the broader claim that Aboriginal Australians represent the oldest continuous living culture in the world. The two burials that made Lake Mungo internationally famous reflect just how sophisticated that culture already was, tens of thousands of years ago. The first, a young woman whose remains were found in 1968, had been cremated, her bones deliberately smashed afterward, then burned a second time and buried. It remains the oldest confirmed evidence of ritual cremation found anywhere on Earth. The second, a man found nearby 6 years later, had been laid on his back with his hands crossed in his lap and his body dusted with red ochre, carried in from a source many kilometres away ochre that had to be deliberately sourced, carried and used in a funeral rite, not simply picked up underfoot. Neither burial was incidental. Both point to people who held complex beliefs about death and who invested real effort into honouring their dead in a specific, repeated, ceremonial way. That matters far beyond Australia. For a long time, the emergence of this kind of symbolic, ritual behaviour in humans was assumed to be tied closely to Europe, where cave art and elaborate burials have long been well documented and heavily studied. Lake Mungo's burials, dated to tens of thousands of years ago, sit comfortably among the oldest such evidence anywhere on the planet, in a part of the world archaeologists had, for a long time, paid far less attention to. It's a powerful, physical reminder that complex human culture wasn't invented once, in one place, and exported everywhere else. It was already here. The footprints add another layer to that picture, entirely not of death and ritual, but of ordinary daily life. Analysis of stride length and spacing shows a mixed group of adults, adolescents, and children moving together across the damp clay pan, some walking, some jogging, and at least one adult male moving at a genuine sprint. It's about as close as archaeology can get to watching people move in real time, 20,000 years before anyone could have imagined their footsteps would still be readable this far into the future. The story of what was actually found at Lake Mungo and how unfolds across more than 5 decades, and it's every bit as eventful as the discovery itself. 1968, geologist Jim Bowler, surveying the dry lake sediments for evidence of past climate change, spotted burnt bone fragments eroding out of the lunette. He returned with archaeologists John Mulvaney and Rhys Jones to properly excavate the site. What they found was the cremated skeleton of a young woman in her 20s, later named Mungo Lady. Her bones had been burned, crushed, burned again, and buried, the earliest confirmed cremation on record anywhere in the world. 1974, Bowler returned to the same dune and, roughly 300 metres from where Mungo Lady had been found, uncovered a second complete skeleton, an adult man in his 50s, laid out on his back, his hands folded, his body coated in red ochre. He became known as Mungo Man. 1999, a team from the Australian National University, using a combination of uranium-thorium, electron spin resonance, and optically stimulated luminescence dating, published a new estimate for Mungo Man's age, around 62,000 years, give or take 6,000. If correct, it would have made him one of the oldest anatomically modern human remains ever found anywhere on the planet. The claim triggered years of pointed scientific back and forth, with rival research teams challenging both the methods used and the underlying sediment dating. 2001, a separate team analysed short fragments of what they believed was ancient mitochondrial DNA recovered from Mungo Man's remains. Their conclusion was extraordinary. This genetic lineage appeared to predate the common ancestor shared by all mitochondrial DNA in living humans today, a result that, if genuine, would have posed a serious challenge to the out-of-Africa model of modern human origins that most of the scientific world had converged on. 2003, in the same year that a comprehensive multi-university dating study finally settled the age debate at around 40 to 42,000 years for both Mungo Lady and Mungo Man. A completely different discovery was made a short distance away. A young Muthi woman, Mary Papin, spotted the first of what would turn out to be several hundred fossilised human footprints preserved in ancient hardened clay, the largest single collection of Ice Age human footprints anywhere in the world, left by men, women and children as they walked, and in at least one case sprinted at real speed, across the damp lake margin around 20,000 years ago. 2016, with the consent of the Barkinji, Ngiyampa and Muthi Elders Committee, a Griffith University team, led by geneticist David Lambert, re-examined the same DNA samples from 2001 using modern, far more sensitive sequencing technology. We'll come back to exactly what they found, because it changed the story again. 1979 to 1981. Mungo National Park was formally established in 1979, and 2 years later, the wider Willandra Lakes region was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Area, recognised for both its geological record and its archaeological significance, one of the relatively few places on Earth listed for both. 1992. After sustained advocacy from traditional owners going back over a decade, Mungo Lady's remains were returned to the Willandra Lakes region, where they have since been kept at the Mungo National Park Visitor Centre, under the custodianship of the 3 traditional owner groups. 2017, after more than 40 years, and following a formal apology from the institution that had held his remains, Mungo Man was returned to country in a public ceremony at the shore of the lake, alongside the remains of more than 100 other ancestors from the wider Willandra collection. If you're waiting to hear whether that 2001 dinar result actually rewrote the story of human origins, keep watching, because what the follow-up investigation found is far stranger and far better documented than the original headline ever was. Subscribe now, because we're about to get into it. Let's deal with the 2 biggest scientific claims that came out of Lake Mungo, because both of them turned out to be wrong, and both of them were corrected through exactly the kind of rigorous, transparent process science is supposed to run on. First, the age. The 1999 estimate of 62,000 years made headlines around the world, and versions of that number still circulate today. But other researchers quickly pointed out a basic geological problem. The layer of sediment sitting directly beneath where Mungo Man was buried had already been independently dated to around 43,000 years old. Since his grave had to have been dug from a surface younger than that layer, a 62,000-year age for the burial itself didn't add up. Separate teams of researchers published detailed critiques through the early 2000s, questioning both the specific samples used and how confidently they could be tied to the actual burial layer, and the original team defended its figures in response. It was a genuine published, back-and-forth scientific argument, playing out across several years in the pages of the Journal of Human Evolution. In 2003, a coalition of researchers from several Australian universities carried out a comprehensive redating of 25 separate sediment layers across the site using optically stimulated luminescence. Their conclusion, now the accepted figure, both burials date to approximately 40 to 42,000 years old, not 62,000. A real scientific claim made in good faith that didn't survive closer scrutiny and was corrected in public in the scientific literature by other scientists doing their jobs properly. The Dina story is even more striking. The 2001 finding that Mungo Man's genetic material represented a lineage older than every living human mitochondrial Dina lineage combined was treated cautiously by many geneticists from the start because ancient Dina research has a well-known, persistent problem: contamination. Genetic material from anyone who has ever handled a sample, in the field, in transit, or in a laboratory, can easily overwhelm whatever fragile ancient Dina might actually be present in old bone, and separating the two convincingly requires technology that, in 2001, simply didn't exist yet. In 2016, working with the direct support and consent of the Barkinji, Yampa and Muthi Muthi Elders Committee, a Griffith University team led by geneticist David Lambert used far more advanced, second-generation sequencing technology to retest the same source material. What they found: the original 2001 sequence didn't belong to an ancient, undiscovered human lineage at all. It was a mix of contamination from 5 different modern European individuals, almost certainly introduced through decades of handling. The apparent unknown ancient lineage simply wasn't there. The team couldn't even reproduce the original sequence itself, aside from one fragment that matched the lead author of the 2001 study. That same 2016 study did recover something genuinely new though: authentic ancient mitochondrial Dina from a different burial nearby, the first verified ancient genome ever recovered from a pre-European contact Aboriginal Australian. It confirmed, rather than complicated, the straightforward picture that Aboriginal Australians are the direct, continuous descendants of the people who first reached this continent, fully consistent with the broader out-of-Africa story of modern human migration, with no exotic hidden branch required. So what actually survives all that correction and scrutiny? Quite a lot, and it's arguably more remarkable than either of the debunked claims ever were. 2 real people, a young woman and an older man, were deliberately cremated and ceremonially buried at this site, roughly 40 to 42,000 years ago, evidence of complex ritual behaviour and belief in an afterlife that predates almost anything comparable found anywhere else on the planet. Several hundred real footprints, left by real people moving at a real calculable running speed, were preserved in hardened clay around 20,000 years ago and are still being carefully protected today, covered with sand and monitored with laser scanning technology so wind and erosion don't finish the job where they started. Multiple independent dating methods, checked and rechecked by competing research teams over more than 3 decades, converge on a confirmed record of human presence in this specific landscape, stretching back at least 50,000 years. None of that required an exaggerated number to be impressive. It's the real, checked, peer-reviewed figure arrived at the hard way. And the human story isn't finished, either. Mungo Man's remains were removed from this site in 1974 without the consent of the Barkindji, Nyampa, or Muti Muti people, and spent more than 4 decades in scientific institutions before being returned. That 2017 repatriation, marked by a formal apology and a public ceremony of song and smoke on the lakeshore, was decades in the making. And people who were there have described watching the sky darken as the first soil went back over the coffin as a genuinely unforgettable moment. Even now, the story isn't fully settled. Traditional owner groups are still working through exactly how the wider collection of more than 100 ancestral remains should be permanently cared for on country. Some elders and representative groups have pushed for individual reburial at multiple sites across the Willandra Lakes region. Others, including the Barkindji native title holders who hold formal title over the majority of the land involved, have argued for a single, secure keeping place instead, so future generations can still access and learn from the collection rather than have it dispersed and inaccessible. Both positions come from the same place, a shared determination that these ancestors be treated with proper respect on their own country, rather than as specimens in a distant institution. It's an unresolved, ongoing, entirely real conversation, still playing out between traditional owners, scientists and government proof that this isn't just a story about the deep past. It's still being written. In the end, Lake Mungo is a place that has already forced science to admit it was wrong twice, in public, and correct itself both times, first on the age of a single skeleton, then on a DINA result that briefly threatened to rewrite human origins. What's left standing after both corrections is still staggering. Tens of thousands of years of continuous human presence. The world's oldest confirmed cremation, and footprints of people who ran across this exact ground 20,000 years before anyone thought to write any of it down. A dry lake bed in one of the emptiest corners of New South Wales, a place most people driving past would assume had nothing left to say, turned out to be holding one of the most important records of early human life anywhere on Earth, and it took careful, repeatable, publicly checked science, working directly with the people whose ancestors this story actually belongs to get that record right. What do you think should happen to the rest of the ancestral remains still waiting for a permanent resting place? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more of Australia's real, deeply researched history and mysteries like this one, subscribe to Hidden Origins.